We built this mini ramp at my friend's house over the last few evenings, and it came out really good. I drew up the plans myself for a ramp that's 2 feet tall, 6 feet wide, and 17 feet long. Here's a closer look at the plans that I drew up. My friend had a nice little spot in his backyard where we could tuck a cozy little ramp like that, so we were working within those constraints. We got all the lumber and materials from the local home improvement store and set to work. The first thing we had to do was draw out the transitions onto a sheet of plywood. To save a little bit of money, we're using 1932 CDX sheathing plywood because it was a little cheaper. It'd be nicer to use a full 3/4 inch ACX plywood, but this will do the trick. We used a couple 2x4s to build a large compass to draw out the transition. Even though I took the time to draw out some detailed plans, you always end up making some mistakes. Fortunately, our first mistake wasn't a critical error. We set up the compass to draw out the transition, and when I got to the end of drawing it out, I realized that we had set it up in the wrong spot. So we actually had to do a couple tries before we got it right. Here we are trying it again, and even then, we still got it wrong. Fortunately, at this point, all we were doing is just drawing out the transition and not actually cutting anything. So we were able to try multiple times until we got it just right. But eventually, we got the compass set up in the right position so that drawing the transition would end up hitting in just the right spot, both at where the deck and coping meet, as well as the bottom of the transition where it meets the flat bottom. All that said, I really like using two 2x4s to make this compass to draw the transition. I think it works a lot better than the classic string technique because this is really rigid, whereas string can kind of be stretchy and leads to an uneven radius. Once we had the radius for our transition pieces drawn out, it was a matter of cutting them out of the plywood. The only saw that I had to cut any of the plywood for this ramp is just my jigsaw, which for cutting the transition works pretty well. I would have liked to have had a circular saw to cut straight lines in sheets of plywood for other parts of the ramp, but we just had to make do with the jigsaw that I had. The jigsaw that I have is just from Harbor Freight, so it's a pretty cheap and low quality one. So cutting the wood definitely took a lot of time, but it got the job done. Once we had the first transition piece cut out, all we had to do was lay it down on the plywood and trace it out to cut the remaining 3 pieces that we would need. Again, because I had such a poor quality jigsaw, this took a while, but all you need when you're making stuff sometimes is just a little bit of patience, and you can get the things done that you need to do. Considering the non-optimal tools, I think the 4 transition pieces came out pretty good. At various points in the construction, we also made sure to paint the wood to seal it in, so that it would last in the weather. Once we had our transition pieces cut, we had to cut a bunch of 2x4s to the correct length to be the studs of our ramp. My friend continued to cut all the different studs while I finished painting the transition pieces on the insides. Once we had a bunch of 2x4s cut to length, we first worked on assembling the flat bottom. The flat bottom for this ramp is 6 feet long, so the 2x4s that are the sides of the flat bottom are just that, 6 feet long. Since the ramp is also 6 feet wide, we needed to cut some studs that go between the sides. To make sure that we end up with that 6 foot wide measurement, these studs are 5 feet 9 inches long. because you have to account for the thickness of the 2x4s that go on the sides. 2x4s are normally 1.5 inches thick, and so that's how we ended up with that 5'9" measurement. Next, we wanted to work on assembling the transition pieces. We had to make one last cut to the plywood parts, and that cut is a notch to accommodate the coping that will be attached to the ramp. Once we were ready, we started assembling the transitions. Just like when we assembled the flat bottom, we used 2x4 studs that went across from one side to the other. These 2x4 studs end up being a little bit longer than the ones we used in the flat bottom, just because the plywood transition pieces that we cut aren't quite as thick as a 2x4. Some skateboard ramp projects are something that you can manage to do by yourself, but when it comes to building something like a mini ramp, definitely having two sets of hands is really useful. It really makes assembling parts like the transitions much easier because one person can hold 2x4 studs while the other person drills and assembles the parts. This is one of the most exciting parts of the project because this is where you really see the ramp start to take shape and you see its skeleton kind of come together. The transition piece is first assembled with a minimum amount of 2x4 studs, 2 for the back, 2 for where the coping goes, and 1 for the end that meets the flat bottom. Once we had that rudimentary structure together, I used one of the transition pieces to make a template to mark out where all the other studs need to go. I put all these 2x4 studs 9 inches on center, starting from the end where it attaches to the flat bottom. Once I had that piece marked out as a template, I just lined it up with the other transition pieces and copied the markings over. This allowed us to easily align the remaining studs where they needed to go and to screw them into place. The finished assembled transition piece looks really cool, and once we had both of them together, we laid them out in the space to see what it might look like, and it's already looking really awesome. It was getting really late at that point, so the next day I came back and did a little more painting on the sides of the transition that were facing outwards. Especially this one side was important to get painted because it was going to be up against the fence, so if we didn't do it then, we weren't going to have a chance to do it later. We also still needed to add some shorter studs spanning across the deck, so my friend cut those to length while I measured their location, and then we worked together to screw them into place. We were trying to be efficient with our materials to save money, so the total thickness of wood that we're putting on top of the deck is only a 1/2 inch thick. So to kind of compensate for the minimal amount of material that we're putting on top of the deck, we're using a lot more studs more frequently. So these studs are being placed 8 inches on center. Next, we drilled out a hole in each end of the coping so that we could attach it to the deck of the ramp. And we also drilled a corresponding hole in the deck for the coping to attach to. There's different ways to attach coping to ramps, but on ramps that are 8 feet wide or less, a good way to do it is to use a bolt from the backside that feeds into the coping where you can thread a nut and then tighten it together. It can be a little fiddly and tricky to do, but once you get it all together, it's a really strong connection. Another important thing we had to do was set up some patio stones as footings to help keep the ramp level where it wouldn't be sitting on a concrete foundation. Once we had the ramp nice and level, we were ready to start putting plywood onto it. We had to cut pieces to different lengths and widths to get it to fit, and also kind of bend and stand on it to help it hold its shape while it got screwed into place. Our first layer is 11/32 CDX sheathing plywood. We originally had some trouble bending it long ways, so we ended up doing this first section sideways. I didn't get much recorded of that process, but this is where we ended up the night before. We got about 2/3 of the first layer of plywood on, and now it's day 3 of construction. I went over and worked on the deck myself for a little bit. Here I cut out the top sheet for the decks, which is just some 5mm underlayment plywood that's normally used for putting under carpeting, I believe, in home construction, but it's got a nice smooth surface, so I thought it would be a good top thin layer for the decks. I also made sure to get in some additional painting time when I was the only one working. We also decided to paint the coping as well for fun. So one end is a lavender purple and the other end is this nice kind of grass green. We cut some additional pieces of plywood to finish out that first layer on the ramp as well as the decks. And we got that all put on and it was really starting to look pretty cool. For our second layer of plywood, we wanted to do another layer of 11/32 CDX plywood, but we realized that that would make our coping not stick out very well after we put the masonite on. So instead, we switched to doing some 5mm underlayment plywood as the second layer. It's a little thinner than we would have liked, but it definitely was easier to work with when we were bending it for the transitions. And it will lead us to the end result that we're really hoping for. We really want the coping to stick out just the right amount so that it locks in good for stalls and stuff. It was starting to get pretty late, so we were trying to hustle to see if we could get the ramp finished before the night was over. So we started putting the masonite on. When you do masonite, you need to countersink the holes before you put the screws in, because the material is so hard, so the screw head normally won't sink below the surface otherwise. And it's really important that the head of the screw is below the surface of the masonite, otherwise you might catch your wheel on it and fall, or when you do fall, you could cut or injure yourself on the screw. We ended up running out of time, but we were so eager to at least try it, so we got the masonite attached with just enough screws to hold its shape so that we could have a test run at least. So here is my friend doing the very first drop in and run on this mini ramp, even though it's technically not complete. But we were really happy with how it had come to this point. So we were so excited for the next day when we could finally finish it. So on the fourth and final evening of construction, we just finished screwing down the masonite with about 100 screws. The screws are gridded out about every foot. And here's the totally finished ramp. We're so excited. And here's us taking our first few runs on the 100% complete mini ramp. Hope you enjoy, and I hope this helps you figure out how to build a ramp of your own in your backyard. This ramp cost about $450 to build, and so as far as mini ramps go, it's pretty affordable. Here's me skidding it. I don't actually know that many mini ramp tricks, but I'm definitely looking forward to learning some more in the future. Hope you have a good day.